For a little backstory, I travel frequently. I live a one-suitcase lifestyle, traveling with the wind for the most part. As I go, I pick up odd jobs and such to make money to get by. As a teenager, I was inspired by Chris McCandless, and I have tried to make my life like his, except keeping in touch with friends and family along the way. I've seen many beautiful parks and such, and I really can't complain about my life. Things were normal until I met Rick, that is. He's a park ranger, a park I won't mention for my safety and your own, and our connection was instant. He was knowledgeable about the park, witty, and quite drop-dead gorgeous if I'm being honest. We hit it off right away, and within the day of meeting we were going out for dinner. We talked for hours, and the next day we met up for a hike. I'm usually weary of strangers, but he was a ranger, so I trusted him. He showed me some beautiful valleys in the park and told some incredible stories about the wildlife along the way. Then he asked me to come back to his cabin. As a woman, this was a red flag. As nice as he was, and as connected as I felt we were, it's still a little unnerving to think about going to a practically stranger's cabin. Alone. When no one knows where you are. But I pushed my fear down and agreed to join him for dinner at his place after his shift. I met him at the ranger station and we drove in his pickup to his cabin. It was set back in the woods, about 5 minutes outside of park property. On the way, he gave me a rundown of the house's history. Passed down for generations, it had been standing in the same place for over 200 years. His parents had used it as a summer house while he was growing up, but had gifted it to him when they decided to move to the West Coast. He had lived here for 5 years, and that's why he got a job as a park ranger. When we pulled down the long drive, you could tell the place had history. Calling this place a cabin feels like an understatement. This cabin was massive, a mansion would be a better word for it. It was grand and beautiful. It did resemble a cabin, just at a larger scale. The yard was huge, with the house set in the middle of the property. The edge of the woods surrounding the property gave me the creeps, if I'm being honest. It was almost dusk, and the woods weren't inviting. They looked scary, like they would twist and change when you turn your back. Rick turned to me once we had stepped into the entryway of his house. "What do you think?" He smiled. "It's beautiful," I said, staring at the tall ceilings and the giant staircase to my right. "I love it." He grabbed my hand and led me to the kitchen. The house really was beautiful inside. The only part one didn't like was the paintings on the wall. They followed you with their eyes, and it sent a chill down my spine. Rick must have noticed me eyeing the paintings, because he then said that's everyone who's ever lived in this house. It's a tradition to have them painted and hung on the wall. I adore them, but they creep me out a little. He chuckled and then pointed at one of the frames. There's me, at the ripe old age of 16. His smile in the photo was the same as it was the day I met him. Big and inviting. Maybe it was the imperfect teeth or the way his dimples shined from his cheeks, but he looked so happy. The painting was gorgeously done. You could tell whoever painted it took lots of effort with the details. He looks like he hasn't aged a day, minus the deeper bags under his eyes and the 5 o'clock shadow that he had now. Maybe it's because I know him, but even to this day his painting is the only one that doesn't give me the creeps. After a few minutes of introducing me to his family and the paintings, we continued into the kitchen. It was just as put together as the rest of the house, but you could tell the utensils and such had been around for a while. The KitchenAid mixer looked like it was from the 60s, if not older. If anything, the age of everything just gave it more charm. The fridge was also from the 60s, and it was quite cute. Everything in the kitchen was nice, and the lack of paintings and their suspecting gaze helped me to calm down. To skip a little bit of the lengthy, unnecessary details, I moved in with him about a week later. Very soon, I know, but I felt like I'd known him forever. And the park that he worked at was beautiful and massive. So much to see. I felt like I needed to stick around. Rick helped me to get a job at a watchtower in the park, and I was making good money too. About 6 months later, I found out I was pregnant. 3 months along. I wasn't really ready for a kid, but I was excited. Rick was stoked also, more than me honestly. He's been a great dad. But he was nervous. After a lot of discussion, I agreed that I would take a leave from work to stay home until after the baby was born, just in case an actual emergency were to happen while I was on duty. I had been off for about 2 weeks now, and it was easy going. I took care of the yard work at our house and ventured into the surrounding woods, although not very far. Something still seemed off about them. I've found ways to keep myself entertained, and it's not so bad. And Rick felt better knowing that the baby and I were safe on the property. That was until the 3rd week of being off work. It was bright and early on a Tuesday morning, although the forecast was calling for rain this afternoon. I figured I'd go out and weed the garden I had started, and then maybe do some light cleaning inside. I spent most of the morning weeding, and around noon I went inside to get something to drink. I was sitting at the counter, drinking some water when I heard it. A faint yell. It caught my attention, but after not hearing anything else I let it go, shuffling through the stack of mail I had brought in earlier. There was a letter from my sister, and I was about to grab a letter opener when I heard it again. A yell, louder this time, coming from outside. And another one, this time I could make out the words. "Oh no, my baby. Please, help me." Even though I hadn't been pregnant for more than 4 months, my maternal instinct kicked in. A fellow mother was having trouble with her baby, and I needed to help. I pushed down the logical questions that I should have had, like why was this lady on our property set deep into the woods? Or what could possibly be wrong with her baby that she hadn't taken it to the hospital and gotten help? I did make one choice before I went outside that to this day I'm still grateful for. I grabbed my phone and car keys before going outside. Maybe it was the thought of needing to take this lady to the hospital, or the deep down instinct of needing to flee in the face of danger, but nonetheless they were safely tucked in my pocket. When I stepped out onto the front porch, I saw her. Walking from the tree line, actually scratched that, limping. In a way that was so grotesque, it made my stomach flip. Something was wrong with this woman, and it was quite obvious. She continued howling my baby as she limped her way closer to the house. The way she moved is something I will never forget. It was scary and gross. Her arms were wrapped by her chest, cradling a bundle of what I could only assume to be her baby. When she stepped forward, she drug her leg behind her. With every step, her body swayed down and then back up again, almost as if her legs were 2 different lengths. She moved slowly and kept her head down. Since she was still pretty far off, I couldn't really see her face, but I could see that her hair was tangled and falling down over her face, and that her head hung far to one side. Her clothes looked old, almost like she had just stepped out of the early 1900s. She looked gross and injured, to say the least. Realizing that I was just standing there when someone clearly in distress was right in front of me, I walked briskly down the stairs. Ma'am, what's wrong? Can I help you? Where's your baby? When she heard my voice, she looked up. The sight of her made me gag. She was terrifying. Her face was covered in dirt and scratches. Her neck was badly bruised. And her eyes, something I'll never get out of my head. They were just like the paintings in the hall, burning a hole right in you and never looking away. She looked at me, and then it was like she changed. She went from the prey to the predator. The bundle in her arms hit the ground in an instant, with no regard for what I assumed to be the baby. She took off, running, if that's what you could call it, never taking her eyes off of me. She came charging right towards me, hobbling at high speeds, making this disgusting gurgling sound. You have my baby. She screamed at me, still charging at me from the edge of the tree line. I was so caught off guard that I just stood there. Then all at once, it hit me that I needed to get the fuck out of there ASAP. I dove my hand into my pocket and grabbed my keys. Taking off towards my car, it was like the woman creature picked up speed. She was about the same distance from me that I was from my car. I ran faster than I ever had. Glad that I left my car unlocked, I ripped the door open, dove into the driver's seat, and slammed the door, smashing down repeatedly on the lock button. I shut the door just in time. The woman reached my car and began banging on my window. My eyes never left hers as my hand slid the key into the ignition and turned. The car roared to life. I threw it into drive and slammed on the gas, tearing up the gravel as I sped down the driveway. Every time I shut my eyes, I could see the woman's eyes. They were bright yellow, such an unnatural color for eyes. Her facial features were gaunt, and she seemed lifeless. Once I reached the end of my driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. She stood about halfway down the drive, with her head hung at that unnatural angle. I couldn't really make out her face, but I could feel her eyes staring right at me. I punched on the gas and took off, going to the only place I could think of, the park. Once I reached the ranger station, I parked my car and sprinted into the building. When I got inside, one of the rangers named Stacia was sitting at a desk. "Jesus, Nettie, you look like you've seen a ghost." She jumped up from her chair and walked over to me, pulling me into a hug. "What's wrong, sweetie?" There was a woman at my house. She tried to attack me, I think. I don't know. I got in my car before she could get to me, I sighed, pulling away from the hug. I just now realized I was crying. "I'm calling Rick back from patrol. You need to sit down." Stacia pulled me over to a chair, and she walked over to the phone. After talking briefly to Rick on the phone, she came back and sat down across from me. "Start from the beginning. What happened?" I told the story in full, starting from when I went inside to get a glass of water. I felt crazy retelling it. It just sounded ridiculous, but there was no denying it had happened. "Is that how your window got cracked?" Stacia gestured out the window. My car window was indeed cracked, pretty much shattered. I have no idea how I didn't notice it earlier. Must have been because of the adrenaline or something. I know I sound crazy, but I swear I'm not making any of this up. She looked into my eyes, and I could see the sympathy. "Listen, girlfriend, I totally believe you. I work at a national park, and I've seen some shit that I couldn't logically explain. I know one thing for sure, you're not going back to that house tonight, definitely not alone. We waited for Rick to get to the station. Stacia told me about a date she had been on recently. The date story was boring, but I'll be forever grateful that she told it to me because it gave me a few moments of distraction from the sheer terror I was feeling. I had made up my mind right then and there that I wouldn't be going back to that house. Not while that woman-like thing was still on the prowl. Especially not if she wanted my baby. The baby that was 4 months old, nowhere near ready to be born, and never ready to be snatched by some foul creature from the 1900s. It seemed like an eternity, but Rick finally showed up. He burst through the door and pulled me up into a hug. What the fuck happened? He pulled back and looked into my eyes. I'm sure he could see the terror. I had been calm while Stacia was telling me her story, but after finally seeing Rick, the anxiety and fear was back. I told the story again from beginning to end, while Rick paced back and forth across the station. When I finished the story, Rick simply said, "Come with me." I stood up and walked after him out the door. I glanced back at Stacia, and she gave me a look of sympathy, but she nodded for me to follow. Rick got into his truck, and I got in the passenger seat. He sighed loudly. "We have to go back to the house." "I'm sorry, but what do you mean we have to go back to that house?" "I'm not going back there. You can't make me. Did you hear a word I said?" "I'm not." "Stop." Rick turned to look at me. I'm not going to lie. I was fuming. I was not going back to that house, not after what I had seen. Not after what had happened. Not today, and honestly, not ever. We have to go back. I know you don't want to, and I know I sound crazy, but we have to. I'm sorry. I was really hoping this wouldn't happen while you were here, but since it did, we have to do something about it. He put his hand on mine for a moment and then pulled away, turning the key in the ignition. Are you going to at least tell me what happened? Who that lady was? And why this happened in the first place? Yes. But you need to listen, and you've got to believe me. It sounds crazy, but after what you've seen, I'm sure believing me won't be a problem. I nodded, not sure what to say. Today, you met Laura. She lived in the house from 1892 to 1917. She was an aunt of mine. Obviously one that goes back a ways. I don't remember how many greats she was. Anyway, in 1917 she got pregnant with her first child. She was an old mother for her time, even though 25 is nothing nowadays. When she finally gave birth, the baby was stillborn. Since there wasn't much for medical things back then, they didn't know that the baby was dead until the day it was born. Laura was overcome with grief from the death of her baby. She carried around its poor corpse for days until it began to stink, and her brother, my something great-grandfather, had to take it from her and bury it in the family cemetery. After taking her baby away, Laura completely lost it. One of her sister-in-laws was pregnant at the time, and Laura went after her. She tried to claw the baby right out of her, the whole time screaming about her baby. My grandpa and uncle were able to break them up, but something had to be done about Laura. They planned on taking her to a hospital for the insane, but they locked her in her bedroom that night, not knowing it was the last time they'd see her alive. She hung herself from the rafters that night, breaking her neck. She's haunted the place ever since. I've only seen her once, shortly after my brother was born, and I never wanted to see her again. But I've heard her story many times. He looked over at me. I was in shock. I believed him. I'd seen this lady, and her neck was definitely broken, but still, the story did sound pretty crazy. And this was a lot to take in. I'd seen weird shit working in the watchtower and throughout my travels, but nothing quite that far out in left field. I just nodded in response to Rick's words, and that seemed to be enough for him. He put the truck in drive and began the trip to our house. After a few minutes, I spoke. "Ricky, what are we gonna do when we get there? Is Laura gone?" "Listen carefully. We can get rid of her for now, but we have to do this right the first time." He looked at me. "Do you understand?" "Yes. Good. All right. When we get to the house, she'll be sitting on the porch on the rocking chair to the far left. She'll have her little bundle in her arms again, and she'll be calm. She'll be fine until she notices you're there. Then she'll get up and begin to approach you again. I know it's scary, but I'll be right with you the whole time, I promise. When she notices you, you need to speak these words. Say them loud and clear so she hears you. Laura, your baby lies not with me, but in a clearing over the hill, in a little basket under the ground, waiting for you. Do you hear his cries? He needs you. It'll be obvious if she's heard you, and then she'll retreat into the woods to the cemetery where her baby is." Rick looked back at me. "Got all that?" "Yeah, I think so. Laura, your baby lies not with me, but in a clearing over the hill, in a little basket under the ground, waiting for you. Do you hear his cries? He needs you." I recited word for word, ready to do whatever it takes to get the ghost away from our house. "Sounds good. You're as ready as you'll ever be, as I guess." He kept his eyes on the road. We were almost to the turn for our driveway. "How do you know this will work? What do we do if it doesn't?" I didn't mean to come across as panicky, but can you blame me? I've never dealt with ghosts before, especially not ones trying to steal my unborn child. "It's gonna work. But if it doesn't, just get back in the truck and we'll leave. But it's gonna work. I promise you that, darling." He grabbed my hand. "Everything's gonna be just fine." "But how do you know?" I wanted to believe him. I really did, but it all just sounded so silly. "Because my mom did it when I was younger. I've heard plenty of stories. My family has been doing this since Laura passed. There's no way to get rid of her, just ways to keep her at bay." He squeezed my hand. Just like that, we were pulling down the long gravel driveway. I could see Laura rocking back and forth on our porch, staring down over that little bundle of blankets. We parked a few yards away from the porch, and we both stepped out of the truck, leaving the doors open. Rick whispered to me, "I'll get her attention, but the second she looks at you, you need to start talking. Immediately." I nodded in response. The phrase was on repeat in my head. I was so afraid I'd forget something and mess everything up. I couldn't risk that. Rick whistled. Just a small little tune, one that I'd heard him whistle many times before as he walked around the house. Laura looked up from the bundle, and Rick nodded. I felt her eyes hit me, and I began. "Laura, your baby lies not with me, but in a clearing over the hill." At this point, she was at the bottom of the stairs, her head hung to the side and her nasty yellow eyes burning holes in me. "In a little basket under the ground, waiting for you." She was maybe 15 feet away, her pace getting faster and faster, coming right towards me. Do you hear his cries? 10 feet. He needs you. The second that you left my mouth, she stopped dead in her tracks. Thank God for that, because at that point she was a mere 3 feet away, and that was way too close for comfort. Suddenly her head whipped to the other side, and she seemed to morph right in front of my eyes. Her legs seemed to even out, her clothes went from looking tattered and old to brand new, and her eyes turned into a stunning blue, seemingly identical to Rick's eyes. Then her neck snapped straight, like a normal person's neck would be. The worst part by far was when she opened her mouth and spoke. Her voice was hoarse at first, but then after a few words it sounded normal and quite pretty. She had a sing-song tone to the way she spoke. I hear him. I do. Pardon me, but I must tend to my babe. Thank you. And with that she turned around and walked back towards the tree line. Her stride was normal now, no longer limpy and painful. We stood, hand in hand, until she disappeared into the trees. I was a lot more at peace than I thought I would be, if I'm being honest. Maybe it was because Laura was just grieving and not actually evil, or maybe it's just because the whole experience seemed surreal. Either way, I was calm. We shut the truck doors and headed into the house. When we got inside, the first thing my eyes did was drift to the hallway with the paintings. I found Laura fairly quickly. She was beautiful, not nearly as frightening as she had been that afternoon. In fact, she mostly resembled the lady who had just returned to the woods a mere 5 minutes ago. The rest of the paintings still felt like they looked directly at me, but her eyes seemed softened. They didn't feel like they burned into me anymore. Thank goodness. I went to bed shortly after that, but there was one more thing Rick told me about Laura that I feel like I should mention. Apparently, Laura only appears once per child. So I'll never see her again unless I have another baby. Luckily, she doesn't appear for children who don't live on the premises. That's good, because I wasn't looking forward to explaining to any future guests why there was a strange lady sprinting her way across the lawn.